My creative work is a pencil drawing titled Unveiling Power, a reflection on global governance. In this artwork, I use a central female figure who is slowly lifting a blindfold from her eyes. Around her, I drew different symbols, an international institution building, corporate towers and money, civil society and groups, and a scale showing climate injustice. I chose to use pencil instead of color because I wanted the work to feel reflective and unfinished. For me, the gray tones represent the hidden and uncertain nature of power in global governance. Power is not always clear or visible. Sometimes it is behind rules, institutions, money, policies, and global relationships. This artwork represents my learning journey in this subject. At the beginning of the semester, I understood global governance is a simple way. I thought it was mainly about governments, the United Nations, treaties, and formal international organizations. However, through the lectures, readings, and class discussions, I realized that global governance is also about power. It is about who makes the rules, who benefits from them, and whose voice are less heard. The central figure represents myself as a learner. The blindfold shows my earlier limited understanding. I was not completely unaware, but I did not fully see the hidden power relation behind the global governance. The action of lifting the blindfold represents my process of learning. It shows that I am beginning to see global governance more critically. On the upper left side of my drawing, I included a large institutional building with flags. This represents formal international institutions, such as the United Nations and other intergovernmental organizations. This connects to Lecture 1, where I learned that global governance is not the same as global government. There is no single world government. Instead, global governance involves many actors, including states, international organizations, markets, civil society, and individuals. This symbol shows that international organizations are important because they provide space for negotiations, cooperation, and rulemaking. However, they are only one part of a wider system, and their power is often limited by states and other powerful actors. On the upper right side, I painted tall corporate buildings, coins, and a global financial symbol. This represents multinational corporations and market power. Lecture 4 helped me understand that corporations are not only business actors, they can influence global governance through investment, technology, lobbying, advertising, and policy influence. This changed my understanding of power. I realized that power is not only political, it is also economic. Corporations may not directly control international organizations, but they can influence trade rules, labor standards, environmental policies, and development choice. Their power is sometimes less visible than state power, but it can be very strong. That is why I painted this part high in the background. It shows that corporate and market power often operates above and around ordinary people. It is not always obvious, but it influences many decisions in global governments. On the lower left side, I painted a group of people holding signs and using a megaphone. This represents NGOs, civil society, and ordinary people. This connects to Lecture 5, where I learned that global governance is not only top-down or state-centered. Civil society organizations, NGOs, society movements, and advocacy groups can also influence global governance. They may not have the same resources as states or corporations, but they can create moral pressure, raise awareness, and push for accountability. In my painting, the people are smaller than the institutions and corporations, but they are still active. Their megaphone represents voice. Their signs represent justice, rights, and public actions. This part of the painting is important because it shows that power is not only held by the strongest actors, there are also forms of soft power, moral power, and advocacy power. However, I also learned to think critically about NGOs. They can help represent marginalized communities, but they may also face accountability issues. So civil society is important, but it is not perfect. Another important part of my painting is the idea of inequality. In Lecture 6, I learned about development governance and the role of the institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank. Before this subject, I mostly thought of development assistance as support for poor countries, but this lecture helped me understand that development governance can also involve power, laws, aid, and policy advice can come with conditions. These conditions can influence how developing countries design their economic and social policies. This made me think more critically about the relationship between the global north and the global south. Some countries may formally participate in global governance, but they do not always have equal power. They may be members of international institutions, but their voice can still be weaker than those of wealthier and more powerful countries. On the lower right side of the painting, I painted a scale. One side shows pollution and industry, while the other side shows a dry tree and damaged land. This represents climate injustice. Lecture 10 on environmental governance was one of the most interesting parts of the subject for me, because it clearly shows the inequality of global governance. Climate change is a global problem, so it requires global cooperation. However, countries are not equally responsible for the problem, and they do not have equal capacity to respond. Wealthier countries and industrial actors have historically contributed more to pollution and emissions, while poor and more vulnerable communities often suffer more from the consequence. This is why I painted the scale as unbalanced. It shows that environmental governance is not only about protecting nature, it is also about responsibility, justice, and power. My final takeaway is that global governance can create cooperation and hope, but it must always be examined critically. Through this creative work, I learned to ask new questions. Who has power? Who creates the rules? Who benefits? Who is excluded? And whose voice is missing? Once we learn to see power, we can better understand both the possibilities and the limits of global governance.